Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the season preview for the San Jose Sharks going into the 23-24 season. And I must say that expectations cannot be possibly any lower than they are for this team. Even amongst Sharks fans, there isn't really an expectation of this team to do particularly well at all. But on the more national side of things, many people are predicting the Sharks to be the literal last place team in the entire league. They were already very bad last season, finishing fourth last in the league, but people are now thinking they're going to be completely the worst team in the entire league, which is pretty crazy, but also not that much of a surprise, considering the major move that the Sharks made this offseason was getting rid of Erik Karlsson, which on paper looks terrible for the San Jose Sharks performance-wise moving forward, considering he was a 101-point player as a defenseman, the best defenseman in the league last year, at least according to voters who gave him the James Norris Trophy. However, what should be mentioned, even if things do end up going worse for the San Jose Sharks this season, is that this one should be a much more exciting and fun season to watch compared to last year. You see, the 22-23 San Jose Sharks lineup was littered with players that were just not particularly interesting or fun to watch at all. Players like Nieto, Bonino, Lindblom, Lorentz, Svechnikov, Gadjevich were constantly in the lineup for the San Jose Sharks, and it's nothing against these players. Many of them very much fit into an NHL role somewhere around the league on the fourth line or potentially as a 13th forward. But when the fact is that there's so many of these types of players in your lineup to the point where one of them is even getting top 6 minutes in the case of Matt Nieto, it doesn't exactly make for very fun games to watch. So even in the games that the Sharks were winning, you were essentially only getting to watch players like Karlsson and Timo Meier actually do well, and yet half the game you had very, very boring type of players on the ice where your kind of eyes are glazing over watching the television or in person at the game. But going into this season, the Sharks should very much have a more interesting lineup. This is because they are, first of all, indexing more heavily on the younger side of things. Many of the Sharks prospects here are making their long-term debuts, or at least are expected to be making their long-term debuts. Players like Eklund, Bordeleau, Thrun, and even technically Filip Zadina, who I wouldn't necessarily index as a prospect per se, considering he has had a few years under his belt with the Detroit Red Wings, but he is still rather young and still potentially has some development left in him. So these are all very interesting players to watch in the circumstance of looking forward into the future for the San Jose Sharks. All four of those players could very well still be effective players for the San Jose Sharks 3 to 5 years down the line, which could not be said about much of the lineup last season. On top of that, even in the veteran players who likely won't be with the San Jose Sharks in 3 years' time are still going to be interesting to watch. Players like Duclair, players like Hoffman and Granlund as well, because these are guys who can end up getting moved at the trade deadline for significant value. In particular, when it comes to Anthony Duclair, if he does well and can return to form what we had seen with the Florida Panthers a couple of years back, like a 30-goal scorer that he is, he can be the type of guy who can get back a second-round pick at the deadline, if not even a first-round pick, which would be huge for the San Jose Sharks moving into this year's draft. And so a lot more interesting players to watch, a lot more players who you are wanting to keep an eye on, and so it'll be an exciting notion to actually have a San Jose Sharks game any particular night of the year this season compared to last year. But now let us jump into the actual lineup that the Sharks are icing. Now, with the actual season start just 3 days away, the Sharks have already kind of narrowed down what their regular season lineup is likely to be. In practice, they are already running a top 12, top 6 type of situation here. Now, I could have very well just mirrored exactly that in my season preview video, but I thought that would be slightly boring, and so I decided to give a slight spin on the lineup and what I think would potentially be the best for the San Jose Sharks. Now, of course, I don't have the same exact insider information that David Quinn has. I don't watch the practices. I don't see what happens in the video room or the dressing room or any potential room in the SAP Center. But on paper, these are the lines that I do think could work very well. So starting off with the first one, I have Hertl, Zadina, and Barabanov, a slight departure from what David Quinn looks to be going with in terms of Hertl, Zadina, and Hoffman. Now, I have substituted Barabanov in for Hoffman for a couple of reasons. The first of all would be that I think Barabanov has that historical chemistry with Tomas Hertl. I don't really see much of a reason to disrupt that, considering those two players have been playing very well together for much of these past couple of seasons. On top of that, I do think that Barabanov complements the other two players on this line much better. You see, Hoffman is a pretty one-dimensional player. He's a very, very good sniper, but that's pretty much all he is very, very good at. And Zadina, while I do think is slightly more interesting as a player to watch in terms of having different capabilities in the game, he is at the end of the day much more of a sniper than anything else as well. And while Hertl I do think has some playmaking aspects to his game, he isn't exactly what you would describe as a pure playmaker either. And so I think you would want someone who's very good at dishing out the puck on this line to complement Filip Zadina, especially since he's a player who does need a bit of help in this regard, and I think Barabanov can do that exceptionally well. And so I do think this lineup would work better. On top of that, I don't think Hoffman should really be in a first-line role, because even though he has had a pretty impressive preseason, it remains still a preseason where there isn't exactly a lot of effort put forward by the teams involved. Going into the regular season, especially with Logan Couture injured, Tomas Hertl will be the Sharks' best defensive forward, or at least best defensive center, likely playing against other teams' top competition. And so that would mean his line would be playing against other teams' top competition. And I don't really foresee a situation where Hoffman matches up particularly well on the ice against players like Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl in terms of defensive capabilities. Hoffman is historically not known to be a good defensive player, and the Sharks are likely to get caved in that position. So I think Hoffman would be better served playing further down in the lineup, and while Barabanov isn't necessarily an amazing defensive forward, he's certainly a step up from what Hoffman is expected to be and should fit in better on this top line. When it comes to the second line, I have Duclair, Granlund, and Eklund. Again, a slight departure with what David Quinn seems to be going with in terms of Granlund, Eklund, and Cunnin. Now, I understand the Cunnin place here. This is exactly the lineup that the Sharks had in the final preseason game of the year, and I think Cunnin complemented those two players very, very well. But the reason that I have Duclair here on the second line is also for a couple of reasons. The first of which is I think that Duclair should be showcased as much as possible. This is much more of an outside of these pure specific looking at the game situation, because this is much more of a long-term move, but Duclair is a player who should be getting moved at the trade deadline this season, and I don't think you really want to have him playing maybe like 13-14 minutes a night on the third line when you could have him playing something like 16 minutes a night on the second line, especially with a player like Eklund or Granlund. He's also a solid goal scorer, and even though he might not fit in that same type of role where he's just going to set up in one particular position like a Hoffman and just look to take shots that are fed to him from great passes, I do think he can capitalize on the strong playmaking of both Granlund and Eklund to actually end up being and perhaps returning to that 30 goal scoring level that we have seen from him in the past with the Florida Panthers. On top of that, we do know that Eklund and Granlund seem to be a duo that David Quinn seems to enjoy. The one thing that I do question is when eventually Couture does return to the lineup, something that I will get to a bit later, how exactly will this duo actually survive? If Granlund gets moved down to the third line, does Eklund follow him? I'm not sure if that's exactly a smart case, but again, I will get to that a bit later. For now, when it comes to this second line, I do think Duclair would fit in a bit better here. Then we have the third line where I have Bordeleau, Hoffman, and Cunnin. Now, this is a bit of an awkward third line. These are essentially the remaining players who you want to have in the top nine. I do think Bordeleau and Hoffman can make a very strong duo. Hoffman, as I mentioned, a good sniper type of player, and playing in the third line, he'll definitely find himself a bit more sheltered against top competition. The same can definitely be said about Thomas Bordeleau, who he himself is a strong goal scorer, but also has very good playmaking aspects to his game that can definitely help out Hoffman and get him some of those goals to make him a solid 20 goal scorer if possible for the San Jose Sharks this season. However, I do think Cunnin fits slightly awkwardly on this line, and I think it might be better served to have a player like Kevin Labanc in this position. However, I do not think that David Quinn will want to have a third line of Labanc, Bordeleau, and Hoffman, because defensively it doesn't exactly inspire a lot of hope, and at the end end of the day, you do still want your third line to be at least relatively defensively responsible. So I think Cunnin, while not amazing defensively, I do think he's somewhat overrated in that regard, is definitely better than Kevin Labanc in that role, and can still be providing decent enough offense in this position. So this would end up being a pretty good third line. Again, as I mentioned, it seems as though Cunnin is penciled into the top 6, and it is Barabanov who would be playing on this third line, and Duclair playing on this third line, Hoffman up on the first. But in terms of my lineup, I do think it works well enough. And then when it comes to the fourth line, this is the one thing that I'm sure I will likely agree with David Quinn on. We have Giovanni Smith, Nico Sturm, and Kevin Labanc. Now this is where it might be a slight departure. The major decision making is between Labanc and Zetterlund. Obviously, Sturm is going to be the fourth line center for this team, probably through the entirety of this season. If I had to guess, there's no way he flexes to the wing, and there's very little way that he actually ends up being a healthy scratch at any point. Giovanni Smith also had an extremely impressive preseason that has almost certainly locked down his spot, at least for the foreseeable future, in the lineup for the San Jose Sharks. And then when it comes to that final spot, that is the decision between Labanc and Zetterlund. Now, I could not in good conscience actually put Zetterlund in the top 12 lineup. He has been so ineffective for the San Jose Sharks ever since being acquired by the New Jersey Devils, from the New Jersey Devils at the end of last season, as well as through this year's preseason, that I have him as the 13th forward at this point, and Labanc as the 12th forward on this fourth line. But I could certainly see a world where Zetterlund end up getting this spot. Zetterlund is likely preferred in terms of defensive capabilities, primarily because Labanc is not very good defensively at all. On top of that, we know that David Quinn and Labanc do not exactly see eye to eye, so this type of substitution is definitely possible, but I do think Labanc could be fine in this role, and offensively it would be best for the San Jose Sharks to have him there, and Zetterlund end up being that 13th forward in case of an injury actually occurring. But one thing that is for sure when looking at this top 12 is, like I said, it is bound to be much more exciting. And what's very cool to see is that last year, when you didn't have that top line on with Timo Meier and perhaps that second line on with Logan Couture, you basically weren't expecting many goals unless Erik Karlsson made something crazy happen with the bottom two lines. Now, taking a look at these top 12, you're actually getting some solid offense from all three of your top lines, and even the fourth line, especially if Labanc slots in there, can actually be pretty good offensively. Sturm had a good chunk of goals last season. Giovanni Smith has shown himself to be an effective offensive player, relative to what a fourth liner is expected to be. And of course, Kevin Labanc, we know, has some offensive capabilities in him as well. And so this could be a very cool forward lineup. However, that is pretty much necessary and may not in fact lead to as many goals as last year because of what the defensive lineup for the San Jose Sharks look like. And that's where we arrive now. The prediction of what the Sharks defensive pairings could look like. And here's the thing with this, is that with the forwards, it felt as though there was a pretty clear hierarchy of this is a first line forward, this is a second line forward, or at the very least, this is a top 6 forward and this is a bottom 6 forward for the San Jose Sharks. Defensively, there isn't exactly a ton of separation between these players. And so at the moment, for instance, I have Kyle Burrows slotted into a third pairing defensive role. He could very well be on the second pairing. He could very well be on the first pairing because there isn't that much separation between the skill levels of these players. So besides me saying that Ferraro will likely be the number 1 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, which is likely to be true, everything else is pretty much up in the air and could change at a moment's notice. Even throughout a specific inside of like an actual game, a player could go from being the third defensive pairing to the first defensive pairing just like that. And so these actual positions of these players doesn't exactly mean all that much. It is more so the players who I actually have slotted in the lineup in general that actually matters. So let's look at that specifically. So on this first pairing, I have Ferraro and Benning. I do view Ferraro as the Sharks' best left-handed defenseman, even though I don't think he was particularly good last season. At the very least, I do look at him as the number 1 defenseman from David Quinn's perspective, so he's here, and the same could be said right-handed defensively for Matt Benning. So these two players pretty much locked down a spot. On the second pairing, I have Thrun and Ruda. Ruda brought in from the Erik Karlsson trade. He is almost certainly to be getting consistent NHL ice time going into this next season. As long as he isn't injured, it seems as though he's perfectly fine to start the year, and so he should find himself in the lineup. I do have Thrun inserted here. He did not play the final preseason game for the San Jose Sharks. Instead, in his spot was Nikolai Knizhov, but I do think for Game 1, Thrun will be the one who ends up winning out, in particular because with Jacob McDonald injured at this point, the Sharks do not have a good option to play on the power play. We saw them run the 5-forward power play unit during that final preseason game, but on the second unit, they did still have a defenseman. It ended up being Mac Benning. It was an absolute disaster. So at the very least, while Thrun isn't obviously amazing in this role, he's better than Benning, and I do think he should be in the lineup. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, as much as I would love to see Knizhov slot in here over a player like Marc-Edouard Vlasic, the odds of that actually happening are exceptionally low from David Quinn's perspective, and so I do still have Vlasic in the lineup. He's joined by Kyle Burroughs, who, considering he was signed as a free agent, will likely get the NHL ice time, and that should end up making up the top 6, at least for Game 1, because the extra players is where things get a bit more interesting. So let us take a look at the two players who are sitting out while healthy for the San Jose Sharks. That is Knizhov and Emberton. Emberton picked up off of waivers from the New York Rangers, played a couple of preseason games, actually looked rather solid, but with the return of Ruda getting back to healthy, I don't really see a world where Emberton fits in over any of Benning, Ruda, and Burroughs for Game 1. Obviously, any of these things can change from a game-to-game basis because I don't necessarily think the gap in skill level between a player like Burroughs and Emberton or Ruda and Emberton are necessarily massive, considering they are all just kind of defensive guys. But for the moment, I think just based on how those two players were brought in sort of specifically by Mike Greer, and Emberton was more of a waiver wire pickup, I do think he sits out at first. And then when it comes to Knizhov, as much as I did appreciate his end of the preseason, I think he ramped up pretty well. As I mentioned, I don't really see a world where Vlasic ends up being a healthy scratch, at least to start the year, and so Knizhov is on the outside looking in. And then when it comes to Jacob McDonald, he's currently injured, so he can't be in the lineup at this point, but when he returns from injury, can he find his way in? I think it likely depends on how Thrun looks throughout the start of this regular season. Thrun had a pretty stable preseason, nothing amazing, but certainly good enough to make the team. But going into the regular season, especially facing off against more difficult competition, depending on exactly where he finds himself in the lineup, is it second pairing, is it third pairing, is it perhaps even first pairing type of minutes, that will sort of depend on how he does to see if McDonald ends up taking his spot or if remains on the sidelines. I do also want to wrap back around to the forwards because one thing I did forget to bring up is, of course, the Logan Couture factor. Couture is injured going into this upcoming season, and so he's not a factor in the lineup for the San Jose Sharks immediately, but he is expected to return relatively soon. I expect him to be back at some point before the end of the month of October, and that really throws a wrench into the lineup here for the San Jose Sharks, because you would think Couture would immediately become the second line center for the San Jose Sharks. That would move Granlund down to the third line center, which, and as I mentioned, Sturm is likely to remain fourth line center, which would put Bordelot in a bit of an awkward spot, and that would either mean Bordelot would have to step out of the lineup, something I definitely don't want to see, or someone would end up having to move to wing. Bordelot could do that, or Granlund could do that, and even Hurdle could do that depending on how things work out. And so it'll be extremely interesting to see what happens when Couture does indeed return to the lineup, but that is maybe a discussion for another day. And then finally we come to the goaltending for the San Jose Sharks. It is obviously going to be the tandem of Kähkönen and Blackwood, and I expect Kähkönen to be the starter for the San Jose Sharks. He just played a couple of preseason games like Blackwood, but looked much better in his 2 games than Blackwood did. Maybe Blackwood drew the short end of the stick because he faced off against a much tougher Los Angeles Kings team compared to the 2 very weak Vegas Golden Knights squads that Kähkönen got. But at the end of the day, can you really decide to play Blackwood over Kähkönen after Kähkönen's most recent fresh performance in your mind is a shutout against the Golden Knights? Probably not. So I suspect it will indeed be Kähkönen come game 1, but this should still very well end up being a case where there is a very much split down the middle in terms of playing time between these 2 goaltenders, and I doubt either of them gets anything more than max 50 games in any either of them. But that will do it for this season preview. As I mentioned, expectations are exceptionally low, even though I do think the Sharks will finish probably closer to where they were last season in like a 4th or 5th last spot, because I think this team will be a bit more surprising than some people think. It is quite clear that there's not really going to be a playoff run for the San Jose Sharks unless literally everything falls exactly into the right place, but at the very least should be much more exciting than last year to see, and we'll see how some of these younger players in the lineup for the San Jose Sharks pan out developmentally. Class dismissed.